we're looking at not only people who agreed with the war and the causes and events of the war, but we're looking at people who were against the war and why. People who are against the war and why. So we have some quotes of different people who were against the war, and these quotes can help answer those assigned questions. So we have Daniel Webster, famous American, so December 9th, 1814, so almost to the end of the conflict of the War of 1812. He speaks out against, not the whole war, but he speaks out against the idea of what's called military conscription or a draft. A military draft is when the government requires usually men, almost exclusively men, to fight in the armed services. Okay. The United States did not have a draft really until the Civil War, and it really didn't become more of a national policy until really World War I. And then it is known in more recent history in the 1960s and 70s with the Vietnam War, where a lot of young men were required to fight, whether willing or unwilling, were required to fight in the Vietnam War. And so there's been a lot of debates about the draft in America throughout history, about whether or not the draft should be allowed or legitimate, whether or not the Constitution, where it talks about that the Congress has the ability to raise and support an army in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. But the debate is whether that necessarily means that they get to make people fight when they don't want to and punish them if they refuse, meaning by putting them in prison or some other means. So when talking about conscription or the military draft, this is why Daniel Webster, in his kind of opposition to the war, he wasn't he was probably opposed to the war in general, but when they started talking the War of 1812, a lot of New England said that they were not going to participate in the war, and they didn't send any soldiers and didn't send volunteers. Massachusetts, their government even instructed people not to volunteer for the war because they didn't believe the war was a good idea. They didn't believe it was just. They didn't believe it was a defensive war. And the New England region traded with Great Britain. That was how they made their living, and it was a big part of their business and livelihood there. And so a lot of them did not participate. Now, toward the end of the War of 1812, there's discussion, and some people are unhappy with that. There's discussion about wanting to make it a legal requirement to have to fight in the war. Okay, so some people feeling like, well, we're fighting this war, or this war is being fought, and New England is getting the benefit of this war being fought, but they're not participating. We should be able to force men to fight in the war. Others said that that would have been unjust or even unconstitutional. So Daniel Webster, the Congress at the time, said this statement here. He said, "Where is it written in the Constitution? In what article or section is it contained that you may take children and compel them to fight the battles of any war in which the folly or the wickedness of government may engage?" And so he's asking there what's called a rhetorical question, meaning to ask the question is to build into it an answer. And he basically argues that there's nowhere in the Constitution that says that the government may force its citizens to fight in any war whatsoever, right? What if the war is unjust? What if the war is foolish? And so that's what he's saying is, look, he didn't believe, he knew full well that the Constitution talked about that Congress can raise and support an army. But he did not believe that that meant the government could forcibly cause people to fight for whatever cause the government decided to get people into regarding a war. So he's asking that question. Now, he believed that the role of the states should be that if the US federal government tried to do this, he believed that it was the role of the states to try to stop them, that the states should try to not allow people to be taken or punished for not fighting in a war. So basically, if there was going to be a draft, Daniel Webster, which there wasn't during this time, but Daniel Webster was arguing that states should not allow that to be enforced. They should not allow people to be taken out of their state to fight for a war that people of their state don't want to fight for. And so he suggested this idea of nullification or state intervention, which basically would be like your state getting in between you and the federal government and not letting the federal government force you to fight in a war. So he says the operation of measures, thus unconstitutional and illegal, so that's how he thinks of the draft, ought to be prevented by a resort to other measures which are both constitutional and legal. Basically, he's saying, look, when the government does something that's unconstitutional and illegal, how should we deal with that? He says, well, we should do something that is both constitutional and legal to respond to it. He says it will be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between citizens and arbitrary power. Meaning this, that he believes that the states are supposed to protect their own authority. The states were the ones that joined together in the Union or the United States, and the states are the ones that have their own local militaries called a militia, and that it's the state's job to protect them from the federal government basically abusing its power against citizens of a state or using power in a way that's inappropriate. Webster went on to say, these are the objects for which state governments exist, meaning state governments are not just, in his mind, subdivisions of a country. State governments exist to protect you from abuse of power of the federal government. He says, and their highest obligations bind them to the preservation of their own rights and the liberties of their people. So he believed that the state governments should basically resist or disobey the actions of the federal government in that instance. This other guy, John Randolph, on December 10th in 1811, a little earlier in the war, before the war really officially starts, but while things are ramping up toward the war, he just asks a few questions and makes some statements about the war, about going to war in order to solve these problems with Britain. That is really war, the justified right answer to these limited concerns that and areas of disagreement that don't mean that they're not serious, but just that they is taking the whole country into a war with Great Britain really the solution? Is it really a defensive war for self-defense of the country? But anyway, he says, but is war the true remedy? Meaning, really, is this the true solution? But is war the true remedy? Who must suffer it? The people. It is their blood, their taxes that must flow to support it. And he says, okay, is war really the right solution, the right remedy? But then he goes, but who really suffers in a war? Is it the government who decides to get into a war? Or is it the people that the government sends into a war? He goes, no, it's the people. He says it's the people, not the government, who really experience all the consequences of a war. He says it's their blood, that's spent in a war. It's people have to go fight and die and put their lives on the line and be killed or injured, or in a situation where there's the risk of both of those things happening. And then at home, people who have to wait for their loved ones who are in a war, that they suffer from that as well, and not having their family member there. And then in addition, they have to pay for it. Their taxes must flow to support it. So it's interesting, a play on words here. He talks about like the flowing of blood and the flowing of taxes. He says, who must suffer by it? He says, the people. It is their blood, their taxes that must flow to support it. So is this war, the War of 1812, really in favor of the American people? Is it really in the defense of the American people? Because he brings up the point that it's not the governments that decide to go to war that usually go and participate in the war and suffer the consequences of the war. It's the people that are sent into the war that have to pay for the war through taxes and through sacrifice of sometimes their lives. Are the lives of the American people, the injuries of the American people, the grief of the American people, and the taxes of the American people really worth giving all that up to get the results of the War of 1812? And that's kind of a good way to kind of think through whether or not a war is justified, or is a good idea. He goes on and says, the government of the United States was not calculated to wage offensive foreign war. It was instituted for the common defense and general welfare. And whoever should embark it in a war of offense should put it to a test which it was by no means calculated to endure. Basically saying that the whole purpose of the US federal government was to only go to war for defensive purposes, the common defense of all the states that are in the United States. So therefore, to go to war with one is to go to war with all of them, that the United States government will go to war to protect those states. However, he's talking about an offensive war, meaning going out of the country, fighting a war in another country that has not attacked the United States. He does not believe that to be legitimate. And then Samuel Taggart, in June of 1812, wrote in a newspaper called the Alexandria Gazette. He wrote, with respect to such wars as are purely defensive, meaning wars in self-defense, he says, nations are many times not left to their own choice. Meaning sometimes there's the case of where if you're attacked and you have to fight in order to defend yourself, or when a nation is attacked and it has to fight in order to defend itself, sometimes it doesn't have a choice but to go to war, is what he's saying. But he says, no doubt such unprovoked aggressions legalize war, meaning that makes war legal and just in that case. But he says, whether offensive war, meaning going out and attack and participating in a war on the basis of not being attacked or invaded, whether offensive war is in any case and under any circumstances justifiable, is a question which ought to be maturely considered. No one pretends that the war, now he says, okay, now there's this other question that you have to think about. Is it ever right, when you're not attacked, to go into a war that's not purely for self-defense or the defense of a country, your own country? He says, okay, that's a question that whether that's ever justified, that's an important question. But his next point is that's not the case with the War of 1812. He says no one pretends that the war in which we propose to engage is purely defensive. Meaning, he says, okay, when you're attacked and a nation has to defend itself, we agree that that's a just cause for a war. Whether it's ever okay to do war when you're not attacked and to go into war for other purposes, that is a debatable point. But he says, but the War of 1812 is definitely not a defensive war. It's definitely not a war of self-defense in which there's no choice but to fight. He says, no one pretends that the war in which we propose to engage is purely defensive. He says, and he explains, he says, no hostile armament that I know is upon our border, meaning you don't have Britain trying to invade, menacing invasion, or endeavoring to effect a lodgment on our soil, meaning Britain didn't invade America until after America declared war on Britain. And so in doing so, America was also taking an incredible risk. And it doesn't mean the whole of America, but the decision makers in the United States government were taking an incredible risk by going to war with Great Britain for the causes for which they went to war. So there were a lot of people who argued and were against the War of 1812. They were not in favor of this war, and they make some pretty interesting arguments against the war in general, which we will revisit from time to time, different arguments for and against the different wars that we look at through American history.